Ever had a rough day and thought, it can't get any worse? Well, medieval peasants would like a word with you. Back when kings ruled the land and dragons filled storybooks, regular folks lived lives so wild and challenging that they'd make your worst day look like a luxury vacation. Because imagine living in a time when about 90% of people didn't even have basic things we take for granted. No electricity, no running water, and definitely no takeout delivery when you're too tired to cook. Just you, your family, and whatever you could manage to grow or trade for. These folks were probably tougher than any gym enthusiast you'll meet today. While we're busy counting steps on our fitness trackers, they were getting an all-natural full-body workout every single day, whether they wanted it or not. And trust me, there was no protein shake waiting for them after their workout. But despite having what we consider a pretty rough life, medieval peasants weren't sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. They created their own fun, built tight-knit communities, and probably had better social lives than some of us modern folks who spend our evenings scrolling through social media. I mean, when's the last time your entire neighborhood got together for a feast? And no, ordering from the same delivery app doesn't count. Life wasn't easy, but these people were incredibly resourceful. They had to be. When you're living in a world without convenience stores or online shopping, you learn to make do with what you have. It's like extreme survival mode, but instead of lasting a few days like those TV shows, this was their entire life. Now that we've established how tough the life of medieval peasants were, let me tell you about their actual work. And boy, did they work. The day kicked off before sunrise, which in winter wasn't too bad around 7 a.m., but in summer? We're talking 4 a.m. wake-up calls. And you thought your morning alarm was brutal. A medieval peasant's work schedule would make today's hardest jobs look like a vacation. They didn't just do one job. They had to be farmers, carpenters, shepherds, and blacksmiths all rolled into one. You know how we have that saying, jack of all trades? Well, these folks invented it because if they didn't know how to do something, they'd better learn fast or go hungry. The farming year was divided into specific tasks that had to be done at exactly the right time. Spring meant plowing, and we're not talking about sitting in an air-conditioned tractor here. 2 oxen pulled a heavy wooden plow while the peasant had to use all their strength to keep it straight and at the right depth. Fun fact, it took about 8 oxen to plow 1 acre of heavy soil in a day. If you lost an ox, you were in serious trouble, kind of like losing your car and your job all at once. Summer brought its own challenges. From sunrise to sunset, peasants would be out in the fields weeding because one patch of weeds could ruin an entire crop. They didn't have fancy weed killers either, just their hands and maybe a simple tool. Every single weed had to be pulled out by hand. My back hurts just thinking about it, and let's not forget about the constant battle with pests. No pesticides meant you had to get creative. Some peasants would actually hire children to run through the fields, making noise to scare away birds. It was probably the medieval equivalent of a summer job, except instead of flipping burgers, you were running around yelling at crows. But medieval peasants actually invented many of the farming techniques we still use today. They figured out crop rotation way before scientists could explain why it worked. They'd plant wheat one year, then barley, then leave the field empty called fallow to let it recover. It's like they were the original agricultural scientists, just without the lab coats and clipboards. Fall was harvest time, and this is when things got really intense. Every able-bodied person in the village would be out in the fields, racing against time and weather to bring in the crops. They used sickles to cut the grain, basically a curved blade that you had to swing just right or you'd end up with more cuts than harvested wheat. Studies show that a good harvester could cut about an acre of wheat in a day, but they had to make about 15,000 individual cuts to do it. Talk about repetitive motion injury. And archaeologists have found that most medieval peasants had arthritis by their mid-30s. No wonder, they were essentially doing CrossFit from age 6. Winter wasn't exactly downtime either. This was when peasants had to repair everything that broke during the year. Tools, buildings, fences. They also had to care for the animals, which meant trudging through snow to feed them and clean their shelters. Plus, this was prime time for indoor work like spinning wool, making candles, and repairing clothes. A medieval winter was basically one long home improvement project, minus the helpful YouTube tutorials. And don't even get me started on the joy of threshing grain indoors during winter. Imagine beating wheat with a stick for hours on end in a poorly ventilated barn. It's like the world's worst drum circle. But what's something that might surprise you is that medieval peasants actually had more vacation days than most of us do now. The church enforced numerous holy days when work was forbidden. Some historians estimate they had around 150 days off per year. The clever bit about medieval work was how communal it was. Everyone pitched in during busy times, and they developed a complex system of mutual aid. If your neighbor's ox died, you'd lend them yours, knowing they'd do the same for you. It was like an early version of Social Security, just with more manure and less paperwork. Recent studies of medieval village records show that these informal support networks were incredibly effective. Villages that practiced strong cooperation were more likely to survive famines and economic hardships. And let's not forget about the specialized skills many peasants developed. Some became experts at specific crafts like beekeeping, brewing, or blacksmithing. These weren't just hobbies, they were essential services that could mean the difference between having enough to trade for necessities or going without. It's estimated that a skilled medieval blacksmith could make up to 100 nails in a day, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize each one was made by hand. After all this backbreaking work, you'd think these folks would at least get to enjoy a hearty meal. Well, about that. The average medieval peasant ate around 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, which sounds pretty good until you realize they were basically doing CrossFit from dawn till dusk. Bread was their main food. We're talking about 2 to 3 pounds of bread every single day. But this wasn't your fancy artisanal sourdough from Whole Foods. Medieval bread often contained bits of sand and grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. Over time, this would actually wear down their teeth. Talk about a real reason to need a dentist. The most common drink was something called small beer. It was a weak, low-alcohol beer that everyone, including kids, drank instead of water. Why? Because the water was often contaminated and the brewing process made the beer safer to drink. That's right, in medieval times, beer was literally safer than water. Finally, a historical fact you can use to justify your drinking habits. The medieval diet followed a strict hierarchy. The best cuts of meat went to the nobles, while peasants got what was left, usually the parts we today throw away or feed to pets. They ate lots of pottage, a thick soup made from peas, beans, and whatever vegetables they could grow. It was basically the medieval version of throw everything in a pot and hope for the best. Sometimes it was so thick you could stand your spoon up in it. Medieval peasants would eat this for days, sometimes weeks, adding new ingredients as they got them. It was like the world's longest-running leftover situation. During good times, peasants might get to eat bacon or salt pork. Fresh meat was rare, maybe a few times a year during festivals. Can you imagine saving up all year just to have one decent piece of meat? It's like waiting for Black Friday, except instead of getting a new TV, you're hoping for a piece of chicken. When they did get meat, they used absolutely everything, from the snout to the tail. They even had a saying, "You use everything but the squeal." Sounds like they invented the original zero-waste movement. But medieval peasants were actually pretty clever with food preservation. They had to be. One bad harvest could mean starvation. They developed amazing techniques for smoking, salting, and fermenting food. They could keep cabbage edible through winter by turning it into sauerkraut. They'd dry peas and beans until they were hard as rocks, literally. Archaeologists sometimes find them and can still identify the species. Some of these preserved foods would last for years, which makes our modern obsession with expiration dates seem a bit silly. During famines, which happened about once every generation, things got really desperate. Historical records show people eating bark, clay, and even leather shoes. There's a record from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 where people were caught stealing unbaked dough from bakeries because they couldn't wait for it to cook. Now that's what I call extreme hunger. Researchers estimate that during severe famines, up to 15% of the population might die. These weren't just statistics. These were real people making impossible choices about who got to eat. The church made things even more complicated by declaring certain days as fish days when meat wasn't allowed. But since most peasants lived far from the coast, their fish might be beaver tail or barnacle geese, because apparently medieval religious authorities decided these counted as fish. I guess if you squint really hard and use your imagination. This led to some pretty creative alternative facts about animals. There were actual scholarly debates about whether barnacle geese grew on trees. Spoiler alert, they don't. Speaking of religion affecting food, The medieval calendar was full of fasting days, up to 150 per year. On these days, you could only eat one meal and often couldn't eat any animal products. But medieval people got creative with the rules. They made almond milk to replace dairy and created elaborate mock eggs from ground almonds and spices. They were basically inventing medieval vegan alternatives. Some of these recipes have survived, and modern food historians say they're actually pretty tasty, though maybe not worth the effort of grinding hundreds of almonds by hand. Analysis of medieval bones shows that peasant children often stopped growing for several years during famines. When food became available again, they'd start growing again. Their bones literally tell the story of feast and famine. Scientists can actually see these growth stops in the bones, like rings in a tree. Recent studies suggest that medieval peasants were several inches shorter than we are today, largely due to childhood malnutrition and endless hard work. On the rare occasions when food was plentiful, medieval peasants really knew how to celebrate. Harvest festivals could last for days, with everyone bringing whatever food they could spare. It was like a potluck dinner party, except everyone was really, really grateful for the food. These feast days were rare bright spots in an otherwise challenging dietary existence. After a long day of work, eating their pottage in their... Well, let's talk about what these folks called home, and trust me, it wasn't exactly house hunters material. In medieval times, the concept of home sweet home took on a whole different meaning. Ever heard someone complain about their one-bedroom apartment being too small? Well, medieval peasants would have a good laugh at that. Their homes made modern tiny houses look like luxury mansions. The average peasant house was about 400 square feet. That's smaller than most two-car garages today. And get this, the whole family lived there, along with their chickens and other small animals. Talk about an early version of a petting zoo. The construction of these houses was interesting, to say the least. Most were built using a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle was a bunch of sticks woven together like a giant basket, and daub was a mixture of mud, straw, and animal poop that was smeared all over the wattle. When it dried, it became surprisingly strong. Recent archaeological experiments have shown that these walls could last up to 50 years if properly maintained. Not bad for mud and poop. And the best part is, what if a wall started to crumble, you could just slap on some more daub. It was like a medieval spackle. About 90% of peasant houses had dirt floors. They would spread fresh rushes on the floor and add herbs to make it smell better. These rushes would stay there for months, collecting bits of food, dirt, and who knows what else. When they got too gross, they'd just add a new layer on top. It was like having a compost pile right in your living room. Some archaeologists have actually found layers of medieval house floors up to 6 inches deep, each layer telling its own story about what the family ate and how they lived. The roof was typically thatched with straw, which could be up to 2 feet thick. It was pretty good at keeping out rain, but it was also a favorite home for rats, mice, and insects. Medieval peasants basically had a whole ecosystem living above their heads. The smoke from their fire had to find its way out through the thatch, since chimneys were a luxury most couldn't afford. This actually had one benefit. The smoke would help preserve the thatch and keep some of the bugs away. Modern scientists have found that this smoke treatment actually created a natural insecticide that helped the thatch last longer. Windows? More like wind holes. Most peasant houses had no glass in their windows. Glass was super expensive. Instead, they used wooden shutters or oiled parchment to keep out the weather. During winter, they'd stuff the holes with straw or old clothes. Light was provided by rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat. They gave off about as much light as a birthday candle, which meant that once it got dark, you pretty much had to go to bed. Recent experiments by historians showed that a typical medieval house at night had about 1/100th the light level of a modern home. The furniture was minimal. Most families had a table, maybe a couple of benches, and a chest for storing their few precious belongings. Beds? Those were a luxury. Most people slept on straw-stuffed mattresses right on the floor. And it gets cozy when everyone sleeps together for warmth. The whole family, plus any visitors, would huddle together during cold nights. Records from some manors show that even relatively well-off peasants might only own furniture worth a few pennies, about the equivalent of $100 today. One of the most interesting discoveries from archaeological digs is the midden. That's a fancy word for the medieval garbage dump. Every house had one, usually right outside the door. Scientists have found everything from broken pottery to animal bones to lost coins in these middens. It's like a medieval time capsule. One archaeologist found a perfectly preserved pair of medieval wooden clogs in a midden. Turns out medieval fashion wasn't all that different from today's trendy shoes. The layout of peasant villages was actually pretty smart. Houses were usually built close together, creating a real sense of community. Most villages had a central green where animals could graze and kids could play. Recent studies of village layouts show they were often designed to maximize sunlight and minimize wind exposure. These folks knew a thing or two about energy efficiency. Archaeological surveys have revealed that many villages were built on slight slopes, with drainage channels carefully planned to prevent flooding. Medieval urban planning at its finest. But living in these close quarters meant everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy? That wasn't really a medieval concept. You could probably hear your neighbor's entire argument about whose turn it was to clean the communal pig pen. Speaking of which, many villages had shared facilities like baking ovens and animal pens. Court records from the time are full of amusing disputes between neighbors about everything from wandering chickens to overhanging trees. Some things never change. And let's talk about home maintenance. It was a never-ending job. The thatch needed regular repair, the daub walls needed patching, and don't even get me started on the smell. But most repairs were community events. When someone's roof needed fixing, the whole village would pitch in. It was like a medieval version of a barn raising, complete with shared food and drink to celebrate the work. With houses being what they were, it's no wonder people spent so much time outside. But stepping outside meant dealing with a whole different world of rules and laws that could make today's most complicated HOA agreement look simple. The feudal system wasn't just complicated. It was like a weird game of Simon Says, where Simon was your local lord, and not following his rules could cost you way more than just being out. Let's start with the basics. Medieval peasants were basically born into a subscription service they couldn't cancel. From the moment they took their first breath, they owed their local lord a chunk of everything they produced. And we're not talking about a small cut. Records show that peasants had to give up to 50% of their crops to their lord. It's like having a really demanding roommate who doesn't actually live with you but still eats half your food. Some manors even required peasants to give their lord the first loaf of bread from each baking. Talk about taking the best slice for yourself. Court records from the time tell us some pretty wild stories. One peasant got fined for collecting excessive amounts of firewood. Apparently, staying too warm was against the rules. Another got in trouble for killing a rabbit on his own land because all wild animals technically belonged to the lord. Even the fish in the streams were off limits. Medieval lords were like that kid at school who claimed ownership of everything. That's mine, and oh yeah, that's definitely mine too. Speaking of rules, peasants couldn't just up and move whenever they wanted. They were literally tied to their land. It was called being bound to the soil. If you wanted to leave your village, you needed permission from your lord. Some medieval records show peasants having to pay a fee just to marry someone from another village. Talk about an expensive dating scene. One record from 1293 shows a peasant had to pay his lord 2 chickens just for permission to let his daughter marry someone from the next village over. The manor court was where all the local drama went down. These weren't your fancy modern courtrooms. They were often held in the open air or in the manor house's great hall. The lord or his steward would sit in judgment over everything from property disputes to petty crimes. One court record from 1320 shows a man being fined for making excessive noise while brewing beer. Apparently, medieval noise complaints were already a thing. Another shows someone being fined for spreading gossip, medieval defamation law in action. But peasants actually had some legal rights, even if they were pretty basic. They could bring cases to the manor court, and some records show they often won. Scientists studying medieval court records found that about 40% of cases brought by peasants against their social superiors were successful. Not bad for a system that was completely stacked against them. Court records also show that women could and did bring cases to court. They made up about 15% of all plaintiffs in some areas. The punishment system was creative, to say the least. Minor offenses might get you a fine, but more serious ones could land you in the stocks. Basically, a medieval version of public shaming. Imagine being stuck in a wooden frame in the village square while your neighbors threw rotten vegetables at you. Some villages even had a ducking stool for punishing troublemakers. It was like a medieval dunk tank, except way less fun, and usually reserved for women accused of being scolds. Archaeological evidence suggests some of these punishment devices were actually quite sophisticated in their construction. Village life came with its own set of unwritten rules, too. Everyone was expected to help during harvest time, pitch in during emergencies, and participate in community events. Recent studies of medieval village records show that those who regularly helped their neighbors were more likely to receive help themselves when they needed it. An early form of social credit scoring. One of the strangest aspects was the hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime, you were legally required to start yelling about it and chase the criminal. Everyone who heard you had to join in. Court records show people actually getting fined for not participating in these medieval flash mobs of justice. In one village, records show a man was fined 2 pennies, about $50 in today's money, for not joining a chase after hearing the hue and cry, probably the most expensive missed workout ever. The most bizarre laws often involved animals. If an animal killed someone, it could be put on trial. Yes, you read that right. There are actual records of pigs being tried for murder, complete with defense attorneys. One famous case from 1386 involved a pig that was dressed in human clothes for its trial. They even gave it a little jacket, probably to make it look more respectable in court. These animal trials weren't just for show. They were considered serious legal proceedings, with detailed records kept of the evidence and verdicts. Speaking of questionable legal practices, it's probably a good time to talk about medieval medicine and healthcare. And trust me, you'll wish you had today's healthcare system after hearing this. If you hate going to the doctor now, you would have loved being sick in medieval times. Their medical knowledge was a wild mix of superstition, guesswork, and things that sound like they came from a Halloween prank gone wrong. Medieval doctors had a real thing for blood, specifically getting it out of you. Got a headache? Let's drain some blood. Stomach ache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it. Time to break out the leeches. These doctors believed that all illnesses came from having too much of certain bodily fluids, and bloodletting was their favorite way to fix the balance. One medical text recommended removing up to 1.5 liters of blood at a time. That's like giving away 3 blood donations at once. Records show that some people had bloodletting done monthly just to stay healthy. But peasants rarely got to see these qualified doctors. Instead, they relied on local healers and herbalists. These folks actually knew their stuff when it came to plants. Recent studies have shown that about 80% of medieval herbal remedies had genuine medicinal properties. The other 20%? Well, let's just say eating powdered owl brain probably didn't cure your insomnia like they claimed. One medieval medical book recommended curing baldness by rubbing your head with chicken poop. Somehow that treatment didn't survive to modern times. Some of their cures were creative. Got a toothache? Try kissing a donkey. Yes, that was a real remedy. Headache? Tie a dead mole to your head. The really fun treatments involved wearing various bits of animals around your neck. Everything from dried frog to fox teeth. It was like medieval jewelry, just grosser and smellier. One popular cure for rheumatism was to carry a potato in your pocket until it rotted. At least that one was relatively harmless. Archaeologists studying medieval bones found that some peasants actually survived brain surgery. They've discovered skulls with perfectly round holes that had healed over, showing the patient lived for years afterward. The success rate was around 80%, which is pretty impressive considering they were basically drilling holes in people's heads with hand tools. They called this procedure tree panning, and some people actually volunteered for it to cure headaches or epilepsy. When the Black Death hit in 1348, things got really interesting. Doctors came up with all sorts of bizarre protective gear, including these crazy beak-shaped masks filled with herbs. They looked like scary bird costumes, but the herbs actually helped a bit. Some of them had natural antiseptic properties. Not that it helped much against the plague, but at least they smelled nice while running away from infected people. Some towns tried to fight the plague by banishing cats, which actually made things worse because rats multiplied without their natural predators. Speaking of the plague, one popular treatment was to cut open a live pigeon and strap it to the patient's feet. The theory was that the pigeon would draw out the disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, but it probably kept the patient in bed. Who's going to walk around with dead pigeons strapped to their feet? They had an oddly specific belief that red objects could cure fever. Some doctors would wrap their patients in red blankets or make them stare at red objects for hours. Women often served as healers in peasant communities, and they were actually pretty good at it. They knew which herbs could ease pain, help wounds heal, or bring down fevers. Archaeological evidence shows that many women healers kept detailed records of their treatments and success rates. But here's the catch. If they were too good at healing, they might get accused of witchcraft. Talk about a tough performance review. Medieval surgery was basically carpentry, but with people. Most surgeons were also barbers, yes, really. That's why barber poles are red and white, representing blood and bandages. They had a saying, fast is good, faster is better. That's because they had no anesthesia except alcohol and maybe a stick to bite on. Archaeological evidence shows some surgeons could amputate a limb in under 3 minutes. They even had specialties. Some barber surgeons were known specifically for removing bladder stones, which they could apparently do in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't all bad. They did have some smart ideas. Honey was used as an antiseptic on wounds, and it actually worked. Modern science has proven honey has natural antibacterial properties. They also used moldy bread on infections, accidentally discovering penicillin about 800 years before Alexander Fleming. Some healers even figured out how to set broken bones pretty well. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with perfectly healed fractures. Despite all this, medieval peasants weren't much shorter lived than people in ancient Rome. If you made it past childhood, you had a decent chance of reaching 60 or 70. Maybe there's something to be said for kissing donkeys after all. Studies of medieval graveyards showed that about 10% of the adult population lived past 60. Not too shabby considering their medical care consisted largely of bleeding and weird animal parts. But staying healthy wasn't just about medicine, it was also about having fun. And medieval peasants knew how to party in ways that would make modern festival goers look tame. Between all the hard work and crazy medical treatments, these folks definitely knew how to let loose. The medieval calendar had about 150 holidays per year. That's way more than we get now. Sure, most of them were religious festivals, but medieval people turned pretty much any excuse into a party. Take May Day, for example. This wasn't just your average spring celebration. It was like Coachella, a carnival, and a village-wide dating app all rolled into one. Young people would go a-maying in the woods, which basically meant sneaking off to flirt, while others danced around the maypole. Fun fact, some maypoles were so tall they had to be permanently planted in the village green. One record from 1343 mentions a maypole in London that was taller than the local church steeple. The church wasn't too happy about these celebrations. There are countless records of priests complaining about ungodly behavior during May Day festivities. Medieval sports were intense. Football wasn't played on a neat field with rules. It was played through the entire village, with hundreds of players, and pretty much no rules except get the ball to your end of town. Records show entire villages getting banned from playing because too many windows got broken. One game in 1280 ended with 3 deaths and a burned-down house. Makes modern soccer hooligans look tame. They also had this crazy game called cock throwing, where you tried to hit a rooster with sticks. Thankfully, that one didn't survive to modern times. Music was everywhere in medieval life. You didn't need fancy instruments. People made music with whatever they had. Spoons, pots, even bones became instruments. Archaeological digs have found tons of simple flutes made from animal bones. They've actually recreated some of these instruments, and surprisingly, they sound pretty good. Professional musicians called minstrels would travel from village to village sharing news and songs. They were like medieval radio stations on legs, drinking games. Oh yeah, they had those too. One popular game involved everyone drinking from a communal bowl without spilling. If you spilled, you had to drink more as punishment. Talk about a win-win situation. Taverns were such an important part of village life that some manors actually required them to stay open. Records show that some villages had one tavern for every 20 households. Medieval people took their social drinking seriously. The biggest parties were usually wedding celebrations. These could last for days. Everyone in the village would contribute food and drink, and the whole community would join in. They had some wild traditions too, like mock weddings where men would dress as brides and women as grooms. One account from 1375 describes a wedding party where the guests played hot cockles, basically a game where you get blindfolded and have to guess who just hit you. Archaeological evidence shows that some villages had special buildings just for hosting these celebrations. Medieval peasants actually invented a lot of the games we still play today. Chess, backgammon, and even card games were super popular, though their version of cards looked pretty different. One deck from 1440 shows kings riding unicorns and queens fighting dragons. Way cooler than our boring modern cards. They also played dice games, but with a twist. Some dice from archaeological digs show they were loaded. Medieval gamblers were just as crafty as modern ones. Special celebrations marked the changing seasons. Harvest festivals were particularly wild. Once all the crops were in, villages would hold huge feasts called harvest homes. Everyone would eat, drink, and dance until they couldn't stand up. Records from one manor show they went through 100 gallons of ale in a single harvest celebration. The lord was expected to provide most of the drinks. Finally, a perk of feudalism. These festivals also included competitions like wrestling matches and archery contests. They even had medieval versions of carnival rides. Young people would make these crazy swings by tying ropes to tree branches or build seesaws using logs and planks. One chronicle mentions a village getting in trouble because their makeshift merry-go-round, basically a pole with ropes attached that people would run around with, got a bit too exciting and sent someone flying into the duck pond. Court records show regular complaints about these homemade amusements. Apparently, medieval health and safety regulations were pretty loose, but not all entertainment was wild parties. Storytelling was huge in medieval culture. After dinner, especially in winter, families would gather to share tales. Some stories were educational, some were funny, and some were definitely not suitable for children. Many of our fairy tales come from these medieval storytelling sessions. One medieval story collection had to be hidden from children because it was considered too spicy. Medieval Netflix and chill, anyone? Speaking of relationships, you won't believe the wild world of medieval dating and marriage. You might think medieval romance relied on love at first sight across market squares, but courtship was way more complicated than that. Forget Tinder and dating apps. Medieval peasants had their own ways of finding love, and some of them were pretty wild. Did you know the average age for marriage was around 20 to 22 for women and 24 to 26 for men? That's actually not too different from today, except back then you were considered an old maid if you weren't married by 25. Dating wasn't exactly casual in medieval times. Young people usually met at church festivals, village dances, or while working in the fields. Court records tell us about one creative young man who kept accidentally letting his sheep wander into a certain girl's field just to talk to her. Medieval flirting at its finest. Although it didn't end well, he got fined for damaging her crops. Talk about an expensive date. Records from 1326 show another guy who got caught climbing a wall to leave flowers in a girl's window. Romantic, until he fell into the pigsty below. Marriage was serious business, and parents were usually involved in arranging matches. They weren't just thinking about love. They were thinking about land, skills, and whether their future in-laws had a good plow horse. One court record from 1319 shows a father refusing to let his daughter marry because the groom's family owned inferior chickens. Archaeological evidence shows that marriage negotiations often involved exchanging gifts. Researchers have found engagement rings made from twisted straw and carved wood. Medieval couples didn't need a priest or even witnesses to get married. They just had to exchange promises. I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband, and boom, they were married. This led to some pretty interesting court cases. Records show people claiming they got married while drunk, or that they thought, "I'll marry you when pigs fly," was just a joke. Spoiler, the court sometimes took it seriously. One case involved a couple who claimed they got married by exchanging vows while hiding in a barn during a thunderstorm. The wedding celebration itself was a huge deal. The whole village would pitch in, and the party could last for days. The bride didn't wear white. That's a modern tradition. Instead, she'd wear her best dress, usually bright blue or green. Red was popular too, except in some villages where it was considered unlucky because it was the devil's color. Studies of medieval clothing remains show that brides often borrowed or rented special clothes for their wedding day. Some things never change. Family life was different too. Newly married couples often lived with their parents until they could afford their own place. Court records show some hilarious arguments between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law about who was in charge of the cooking pot. One record from 1352 describes a 3-day argument about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Another mentions a family feud that started because someone used the wrong spoon to stir the pottage. Children were expected to help with work from an early age. By 6 or 7, kids were doing real jobs like scaring birds from crops or helping with spinning wool. But it wasn't all work. Archaeological digs have found lots of medieval toys like little clay horses and wooden swords. They've even found medieval baby bottles made from cow horns. Scientists analyzing these bottles found traces of milk proteins, showing they were actually used to feed babies. The roles of men and women were pretty fixed, but there were some surprises. Women could own businesses. Records show female brewers, bakers, and even blacksmiths. One village had a woman who was the official rat catcher. She was apparently so good at her job that other villages tried to hire her away. Analysis of medieval tax records shows that in some towns, up to 30% of businesses were owned by women. Marriage wasn't always forever, either. While divorce didn't exist, couples could get an annulment if they could prove their marriage wasn't valid. Some of the excuses were amazing. One man claimed his marriage should be annulled because his wife was too fond of cheese. Another claimed his wife was a witch because their chickens stopped laying eggs after they got married. The church courts heard thousands of these cases. Some estimates suggest about 5% of medieval marriages ended in annulment. But despite all the rules and arrangements, medieval people still found ways to follow their hearts. Court records are full of stories about couples who ran away together, secret marriages, and romantic gestures. One man got in trouble for stealing flowers from the Lord's garden to give to his sweetheart. Another carved love poems into a church wall. They're still there today. Archaeologists have even found love letters written on pieces of bark and hidden in walls. Speaking of the church, it played a huge role in everyone's life, not just in marriage. And trust me, when it came to medieval religion, things got really interesting. The church ruled medieval peasant life with an iron fist and a hungry collection plate. For peasants, religion wasn't just something you did on Sundays. It controlled pretty much every moment of their lives. And boy, did it drain their already empty pockets. Peasants had to give the church something called a tithe, which meant 1/10 of everything they produced. Everything. Got 10 eggs? 1 goes to the church. 10 apples? Same deal. 10 bags of grain? Yep, the church gets 1. For peasants who barely had enough to eat, this was a huge burden. Records show the average peasant family gave away about 10% of their crops to the church, on top of the payments they had to make to their Lord. But that wasn't all. They had to pay extra for any church service they needed. Want your baby baptized? That'll cost you a chicken. Getting married? Better save up some grain. Even dying wasn't free. Families had to scrape together payment for funeral services. One peasant's diary from 1324 complains that his family had to sell their only cow to pay for his father's funeral. The church calendar controlled when peasants could work, too. Besides Sundays, there were saints' days, feast days, and special celebrations where working was forbidden. Sounds great until you realize no work meant no food, but you still had to give the church its share. Court records show peasants getting fined for trying to harvest on holy days, even when rain threatened to ruin their crops. One desperate farmer got caught picking peas on St. Mark's Day. His fine was twice what the peas were worth. But they developed this clever mix of Christianity and old folk beliefs to help them get by. A peasant might go to church in the morning, then secretly visit the local wise woman for a blessing on their crops in the afternoon. Archaeological digs in peasant homes have found Christian crosses buried next to good luck charms made from herbs and bones. They were covering all their spiritual bases. For peasants, anything that might help their crops grow was worth trying. The local priest had huge power over peasants' daily lives. He could refuse to give them the sacraments, which they believed were necessary for salvation, if they didn't pay their dues or behave properly. Records show one priest who wouldn't baptize a peasant's baby until the family paid an old church debt, with interest. But some priests were more understanding. Manor court rolls mention a priest who would accept labor in the church gardens instead of money from the poorest families. For peasants, the church building itself was a constant drain on their resources. They had to help maintain it for free, providing labor and materials on top of their regular work. One village account shows peasants spending 6 weeks rebuilding a church wall. That's 6 weeks they couldn't work their own land. But they had no choice. Refusing to help could get you excommunicated, which meant being completely cut off from the community. The fear of hell was a powerful tool used to keep peasants in line. Church paintings showed peasants being tortured in hell for things like stealing food or skipping mass. Records from peasant trials show people confessing to minor crimes because they were terrified of dying with unconfessed sins. One peasant woman admitted to stealing a loaf of bread 20 years earlier because she was worried about her soul. But medieval peasants found clever ways to deal with all these religious demands. They'd make deals with saints, promising future payment if the saint would help them now. They'd share the cost of religious services between families. Some would even time their confessions for after harvest when they had more to pay with. Court records show one group of peasants who rotated church attendance. Each family would send one person to represent them all, sharing the time burden. Looking at all these records, court cases, and archaeological findings shows us just how creative and resilient medieval peasants were, finding ways to balance their beliefs, bend the rules when needed, and somehow keep their spirits up through it all. Their relationship with the church perfectly sums up what it meant to be a medieval peasant. Life was incredibly hard, but they always found ways to make it work. Maybe in that way, they weren't so different from people today, just trying to navigate life's rules while keeping food on the table and hope in their hearts.